When I started studying comparative education, the work of Isaac Kandel was very well known. He's fallen out of fashion for a number of reasons, not least that he's pale, stale and male, like myself, but we struggle on. And he drew a sharp distinction between centralised educational systems and decentralised educational systems. And this is a distinction that should have fallen out of favour in any case, whatever you think of Isaac Kandel himself. But the principle was that you take an educational system like France. It was very strongly centralised, directed by a central ministry, but you take an educational system like the United States, and educational responsibility is distributed to the various different states, and each has responsibility for its own educational system. But it's a very crude dichotomy between centralisation and decentralisation, and it doesn't make a lot of sense because the centralised state system of the state of New York is bigger than a lot of countries. So centralisation, decentralisation is a rather crude way of looking at things, and I think one of the jobs we're here for is to disrupt dichotomies that become too firmly settled. But the idea of centralisation and decentralisation, well, it's disappearing from some analyses, partly because countries that we thought we knew were centralised, like France, has become less centralised, and partly because systems that we thought were decentralised, like the UK or the United States, seem to be becoming more centralised. So action is blurring the distinction, but during the 1960s and 1970s there were a lot of educational reforms which were primarily devoted to the idea of decentralising control. Decentralisation was seen as a good thing. You might say it's part of the neoliberal project to bring decisions closer to the people who are the users of the system, and the mechanism that's advanced for doing that is a market mechanism. But the economists have for a long time said the people who use a system, the people who are at the coalface, as it were, should be, since they know most about how the system operates, they should be the ones who are most involved in the decision making. But what I want to think about today is a tool for making more subtle the distinctions between centralisation of power and decentralisation of power, because although it's disappearing from the academic literature, I don't think it's disappearing from the policymakers' perspective. They see decentralisation, generally speaking, as a good thing or a bad thing, and they see it in very crude terms, and in the popular imagination it's common to say you can't be sovereign if you are constrained by any outside forces. I want to say we actually do. The context of the local is set by the national, and the national context is set by the international context, and so everybody is constrained. Even the most powerful nation in the world has to consider how other nations are going to react. It may not need to be directed by them exactly, but and the failure to understand that the national is important because it sets the context for the local, even if the local is autonomous within that, it leads to a kind of mentality that says that we're we're only free if we're under no constraint. If we're not under the constraint of being part of Europe, we're not under the constraint of being driven by international law. If we're subject to some external constraint, then we're not free. Well, we're all subject to some external constraint. And what I want to try and do is to try and present a formalised understanding that will allow us to analyse the relationships between the local and the national in a more subtle way. And what I'm going to do is look at a technique. When I was an undergraduate engineering student, I learned many things, not as many as my supervisors and tutors wanted me to learn, but I learned many things. And one of the concepts that I was introduced to was a system of structuring constraints called linear programming. Let me describe it in its physics context, if you like. If we're designing an electric circuit, we might be designing a condition in which a transistor has to operate. And we've bought the transistor from the store, and we're now going to design the circuit that it has to fit into. And when we look at what it does, look at what the transistor does, it operates in a space, not a physical space, but a policy space, if you like, defined by the voltage that's applied to the current and the current that flows through the transistor. And if, depending on the transistor that you've bought, you exceed a certain voltage, then the transistor will break down. So we must stay below a certain voltage. And that voltage, let's put that in here, that represents a constraint. We mustn't go above that voltage. Similarly, if too large a current flows through, then it will break down. We mustn't go beyond that limit of the current. And finally, if too much power is dissipated in the transistor, it will melt, and so we need to reduce or stay below a limit on power. And power, voltage times current is the limit on power will look like that. And if you want your transistor to function properly, it must be in this space, in the allowed space. There's two things to say about this. One is about in relation to the boundaries that are bounding. If we cross this boundary, we cross the maximum voltage boundary, the transistor will fail in one particular way. If the transistor moves across this boundary, it will fail in a different way, and if we move across this boundary, it will fail in yet a third characteristic way. So that which boundary you are closest to, whether you are here or here, is actually important, because it tells you what you've got to worry about in terms of the transistor breaking down. If you want to work somewhere outside, now if we want to work there, we're going to have to move this boundary back. We're going to have to push that boundary back until it's here, and we can then work inside the constraint. And what you do in order to get a transistor that will put up with more power being dissipated in it, you buy a more expensive transistor, or you add some heating fins to it, or you do something that will allow it to cope with more heat. That will be quite a different concern than if you wanted to cross this boundary. Different kinds of things, different kind of remedies would apply, and it may be a different cost to move that boundary than to move this boundary. The idea of the cost of moving a boundary is very important. Now, having said that, let's try and look at, imagine that we're in a school and we have to make decisions. Let's say we're going to decide between concentration on science curriculum or a concentration on the arts curriculum. And we make the decision within certain constraints. We can't go above a certain amount of science teaching because we don't have enough science teachers. We can't go above a certain amount of arts teaching because there's a certain amount of arts teachers that we've got, and we can't exceed the amount of time they have in the classroom. And there's some kind of constraint on providing a balanced curriculum. Let's suppose the national government sets some criteria that you have to have a balanced curriculum, and so we can't go all of one way or all of the other. This will be analogous to the transistor situation, that we can move the boundaries at some cost. How might we persuade the system that we can, how might we change the system so that we can do more science teaching? Well, if we want to do more science teaching, we need more science staff, we need to find some money from somewhere. What's the cost of finding more money? How many garage sales will I have to hold? How many raffles will I have to hold in order to find enough money to fund another science teacher? How much political activity will be required to persuade the government to shift this boundary a little way, so that this offers a possibility for understanding what it's like to be in a constrained place, but a constrained place which is not bounded by fixed and unalterable boundaries, but which boundaries can perhaps in some cases be moved. Would you rather be living in a room with very small space, but you can move the walls rather easily, or would you rather be in a larger space, but the walls are harder to move? It's how much policy flexibility do you want at the local level, and recognise that the national government always sets the context, so that the context for the national is always set by the international. So nobody is without boundaries, nobody gets to do exactly whatever they want, but if you're at the local level, the national government has set a perimeter and says you're free to work within that area. It might be a very tiny space that you have freedom to work within, or it might be a very large space, but the local context is always set by the legislative framework at the national level, and the national level framework is set within the context of international treaties, international expectations, the availability of products that are suitable for the curriculum, books, films, audio, cassettes and so on. But remember, although the boundaries are there, we are constrained by external circumstances. We don't need to always think that those boundaries are immovable. Political action or spending or economy somewhere else can often help us to be able to move the boundary. So that's linear programming, and what I'm suggesting is that in many cases schools, local authorities, local educational authorities are working within constraints, and what's important is this kind of analysis tells us when and how policies might fail. If you're failing because you don't have enough money in the system, that's different from failing if you don't have enough qualified teachers, and will require different policy actions. So that this is not only helpful in deciding whether a policy is going to work or isn't going to work, it's helpful in providing diagnoses that are differential. Differential diagnoses are important, but we're not very good at them in terms of educational policy, because we come up with ridiculous ideas like sustainable educational policy, sustainable educational development. We work on the assumption that once we've dreamed up a policy, it's never going to fail. It's going to carry on sustainably forever. Like politicians' careers, policies always end in failure, and we need to be thinking about how they're going to fail and whether we can recognise which way, in what way would we prefer the system, would we prefer the policy to fail. So I want to suggest to you that there's a way of looking at policies. So it might be, are we going to spend more money on buildings or more money on staffing? Are we going to do more science teaching or more arts teaching? Are we going to have more bigger schools and fewer little schools? How are the constraints going to work for how far people have to travel to their schools? Any policy, we can formulate it in a way that says it's in a particular space, defined by variables. It doesn't need to be only two. I give you an example which is based on only 2 dimensions because it's much easier to draw and understand, but linear programming can be done in 3 or even more dimensions to see what boundaries are going to be crossed and whether a policy is going to be in the area where the policy will work or the area where the policy won't work. One other thing is to say, look at this again. I've said before, I have a hunch. My gut feeling is that systems are not deterministic. It's not a question of the Minister of Education says, do this, and everyone jumps to do it. Local politicians, local teachers, local activists are looking at the policy as set by the national government and are looking at ways that they can achieve their ends within it. And so any of those policies that might work are up for grabs, persuading people to move in this direction rather than that direction. There's no system that is strictly and rigidly determined by the policymakers at the central level. And so we need a way of understanding how the decision making at local level and the decision making at national level knit together. And this is one way of seeing how the policy making at the national level places constraints on the local level and the way the local level works within those constraints. So I'm looking for this as a way, and I've written some texts, some papers particularly about financing of education, financing of higher education, and what kind of policies were involved, particularly in the reform of the higher education system of the UK in the 1970s, as people looked for policies that would work within the national framework. It's attractive to the government because the government at that time didn't want to tell universities do this or do that. They wanted to steer them in a particular direction. And so by shaping the constraints, they thought they could steer the system without directing any individual institution as to exactly what it had to do. It's my opinion they didn't quite understand how to work this system, but theoretically, conceptually, this is a way of handling, disrupting the centralised, decentralised debate and making it closer to a realistic understanding of people at a local level working within national constraints.